We have seen a militarization of the Arctic in recent years. This has in part been attributed to the worsening security climate in Europe. So the Arctic really has two components. There's the eastern section that's above Europe, and there's the western section above the United States and in Canadian territory. And the Western Arctic has not been militarized. So when we're talking about the militarization of the Arctic, we're referring to the eastern part of the Arctic. So this being said, we've seen a militarization reflecting the adverse security environment in Europe. The US reactivated its second fleet. This was deactivated in 2011. It had been in place since World War II, and this is a fleet that covers the North Atlantic and the Arctic, the Eastern Arctic area. We have seen more military exercises by NATO, by Russia. We have seen the investments in Arctic infrastructure that the US and Russia and other countries are making, the greater attention to Arctic security questions in the United States. So it is concerning, and particularly since there is a lack of mechanisms to discuss these security issues, there is a tendency to respond to military developments in Russia without looking into the context of these developments. Russia has some legitimate interests in terms of having the longest Arctic coastline and having a large share of its GDP produced by oil and gas in the Arctic regions, and so it does have legitimate security interests there. And we need to take those into account as we see Russia's actions. There is a potential for Russia to disrupt NATO's sea lines of communication and potentially to exclude US and NATO forces from the region. So that is a concern. Also, the Arctic is an area which is important in terms of nuclear weapons, in terms of missile defense, in terms of missile pathways, and so it makes sense that there's concern by the military on access to the Arctic for this particular reason. I think, though, that the concern about the Chinese military role in the Arctic is premature, that China has established capabilities that are dual use potentially, but not necessarily directed at militarization in the near term. For example, China's search for ports could be used for shipping and other resource projects, and are not necessarily a prelude to establishing military bases. China's research cooperation with Iceland and Finland and Sweden and Russia are applicable to its economic interests in the region, but might also be used more broadly for military missions in the future. So underwater sensing could be used for shipping, but also for submarines, for example. And so I think there's a tendency to do some worst case planning, looking at Chinese actions in the Arctic and interpreting them in the long term as a military threat, when in the short term we don't see Chinese submarines in the Arctic, for example.